Mewtwo. We all know its story at this point. Created by Team Rocket as the ultimate biological superweapon, they lost control, it turned a bunch of people into stone somehow. He's great. A cautionary tale of the dangers of meddling with nature, and one of the most iconic science fiction villains of all time. But what if I told you that this science isn't as fictional as you might think? What if I told you that this type of genetic engineering isn't only possible, but that equally vicious synthetic abominations of nature walk this earth at this very moment? Oh, they're cute! Today, we're going to learn about all of the real-world science that led to the creation of Mewtwo, how it relates to the controversial de-extinction of a really big wolf, and using that information to try and uncover the exact genetic recipe that Team Rocket used to create Mewtwo. Richard, hit that intro! One of the reasons why Mewtwo is so interesting and iconic is that it has more lore than, I think, any other Pokemon to date. It is a one-of-a-kind, completely synthetic Pokemon created by Team Rocket in the basement of the Pokemon Mansion. It's often described as a clone of the Pokemon Mew, hence the name Mewtwo. But that's not necessarily the most accurate description. See, a clone is a complete genetic copy of a living organism. We've actually done it a bunch of times in the real world. You can learn more about that process in this video if you're interested. And don't worry, you don't have to know what Phasgoo is to enjoy it. In fact, it's probably for the best if you didn't. Nobody needs to know about Phasgoo. But Mewtwo is not a genetic copy of Mew. Clearly, just look at it. According to the Pokedex, its DNA is based on Mew, but it has undergone, and I quote, years of horrific gene splicing and DNA experiments. Yikes. In the end, this is not another Mew. It is a completely new species that has never existed before. And that brings us to the dire wolf. Those who follow science news in the media may have already heard about this, but late last year, the biotech company Colossal Biosciences claimed to have de-extincted the dire wolf, which would have been the first instance of humanity successfully bringing an extinct species back to life. Now, as with pretty much everything in science, the truth is a lot more complicated than the clickbait headlines would lead you to believe, and, if you ask me, a lot more interesting. As a little background, the dire wolf was a type of wolf native to North America during the late Pleistocene epoch, around the time of the last ice age. They were, by all accounts, pretty similar to a lot of modern-day wolves and canids, only, like a lot of things during that time, just a little bit bigger. They went extinct around 10 to 12,000 years ago, never to walk the earth again. So how did Colossal bring them back? Well, the answer is simple. They kind of didn't. And also, it's really not that simple at all. There are two main methods that we know of today for potentially bringing an extinct animal back. The first is through cloning. If you find enough DNA for an extinct species in fossils and remains, like, say, a woolly mammoth, you could create an embryo with that exact genome, implant it in a close modern relative like an elephant, and have it give birth to a real woolly mammoth. An exact copy of one that actually existed. That is, inarguably, a real woolly mammoth brought back from extinction. There is one problem with cloning though, and that's that it's really freaking hard. To date, we've only managed to clone animals from around 25 living species that we have a ton of DNA from. Doing this with a genome that we've cobbled together from a handful of fossils and creating a complete genetic replica of a direwolf is pretty much impossible. And perhaps not entirely necessary. For those who need a little refresher from high school biology, DNA is basically organic code existing in all of your cells. Different sequences of genes determine different physical traits. If you could change someone's genes, you could change the traits that they're born with. So, instead of trying to completely recreate the direwolf genome, Colossal started with DNA from a living gray wolf that they figured out how to extract from blood cells in a non-invasive process. Then they figured out which genes correlated to specific physical traits like size and fur color. Then they simply snipped out those genes, don't need that anymore, and slotted in new ones from the dire wolf genome. And the result of all that gene editing were these three little guys, Remus, Romulus, and Khaleesi, named after the two mythological brothers who were raised by wolves and founded Rome, and the lady from Game of Thrones who burned down a whole city. Sure. Now if you're thinking, hey, that kind of sounds like Jurassic Park, it's because it's pretty much exactly what they did in Jurassic Park. And side note, Mewtwo's Pokedex entry makes it sound like this genetic engineering was done while Mewtwo was alive. That's not how it works. What you really do is create an egg cell with the exact DNA that you want and implant it into a surrogate mother. So these wolves weren't grown in a test tube or anything. A real dog gave birth to them and they were born with these traits already. Now, there's a lot of debate in the scientific community as to whether these new pups count as dire wolves, if they're still gray wolves that were made to look dire wolfy, or if they're a completely new species altogether. Colossal's belief is essentially that if it looks like a dire wolf, sounds like a dire wolf, and acts like a dire wolf, then it's a dire wolf. More specifically, if it can slot into the same ecological niche that the dire wolf once occupied, then it counts as a successful de-extinction. But other scientists argue that gray wolves and dire wolves aren't actually that closely related, and these new puppies might be quite different from the true dire wolf. Defining a species is super difficult because we sort of made the idea of a species up. The way that we label and categorize things doesn't change the nature of that thing. Though I will admit, from a marketing standpoint, saying you brought the giant wolves from Game of Thrones back from the dead is gonna get you a lot more attention and funding, even if it's not entirely true. But for today's video, none of that is important. What is important is that this process could be used to create an entirely new species if you wanted to. Colossal's goal was to make some gray wolf DNA as similar to dire wolf DNA as they could. But they could have done whatever they wanted. Well, I mean, not whatever they wanted. Genetic engineering is insanely complicated, but you get the idea. The point is, the way that Mewtwo was created sounds remarkably similar to Colossal's dire wolf project. They started with the DNA of Mew as a base and spliced in new genes to get specific traits that they wanted. Grab a special attack from here, an ability from there, and so on. And I think that begs the obvious question. Whose genes did they use? What genetic cocktail could create a Pokemon with this exact stat spread and move pool? Well, with the caveat that all of this is based on scientific breakthroughs 30 years after Red and Blue came out, and Game Freak were certainly not thinking about any of this when they made Mewtwo, I think I figured it out. First, we have to figure out how exactly this process works in the Pokemon world. And funny enough, we actually have a few examples to go on. Genetic engineering is a pretty controversial topic in our world, but I guess these guys couldn't care less about ethics. And not just the bad guys either. In Galar, they're not just de-extincting animals, but bashing them together like a Mr. Potato Head. Look at these things. These absolute affronts to nature, shining pillars of the hubris of humanity. You thought Mewtwo was bad, this guy is just a severed head on the end of someone else's tail. Now, unfortunately, we don't have enough information here to figure out what the base stats and move pools of the original Pokemon might have been, or how they're affected by the splicing process. But in Generation 5, we get some items literally called the DNA Splicers that we can use to fuse Kyurem with either Reshiram or Zekrom. Seems like a totally chill and responsible thing to put in the hands of a literal child. Comparing the base stats of Black and White Kyurem to the other legendaries that make it up, we can see that most of the base stats are simply inherited from one of the donors, which makes sense. You start with some Zekrom DNA, snip out the gene sequence that determines HP, and plug in Kyurem's instead. There are some exceptions, but we'll get to that later. So, whose genes could have been used to turn these stats into these stats? Well, interestingly, Mew and Mewtwo do not share a single base stat between them, which means that every single one of Mewtwo's stats must have been altered through gene splicing. For example, Mewtwo has an HP stat of 106, which it shares with a few other species. I'm going to assume that Team Rocket didn't have access to any Ultra Beasts or other legendary Pokemon besides Mew. Otherwise, why would you need to make Mewtwo in the first place? Or any Mega Evolutions, because that doesn't really make sense. Excluding all of those, that means that the genes that determine Mewtwo's base HP stat must have come directly from a Hydrapple. Weird choice, but okay. Unfortunately, the rest of the stats aren't as cut and dry, and there are a few possible options. For example, its speed of 130 could have come from Aerodactyl, Ice-Q, Crobat, or Jolteon. Now, any of the Kanto Pokemon might seem like the obvious choice, considering where Mewtwo was created. However, I think there is a more likely option. Mewtwo's base defense of 90 is shared with a bunch of different Pokemon, but only one from this list. Ice-Q. This could suggest that the genes that determine speed and defense are somehow linked, and in splicing in Ice-Q's high 130 speed, they inadvertently brought its 90 base defense along with it. This would explain why Mewtwo has a lower defense than Mew, despite ostensibly being an upgrade. And yes, that does mean that Team Rocket's compassionless super weapon is part this thing, which I think is funny. A similar thing is true for Mewtwo's attack and special defense. There are a lot of possible contenders for each, but Meowscarada— Yo, what's up? It's me in the edit. Apparently, I don't know how to read a wiki. It's Stoutland, not Meowscarada, is the only one that has both. However, for special attack, we run into a bit of an issue. There are no other Pokemon in existence with a base special attack of 154. True, it is possible that this could have come from a Pokemon that we just don't know about yet, or that they directly edited the gene to create this trait as opposed to pulling it from somewhere else, but that's no fun, and I think there is a better way. If you look at White Kyurem's special attack stat, you can see that it's actually higher than both Kyurem and Reshiram, the Pokemon that made it up. This shouldn't be possible with pure genetic splicing, unless special attack is controlled by a series of genes that compound with one another, creating a stat that's greater than both of its parts. Looking at both Black and White Kyurem, it seems that these compounding traits are equal to the higher of the two stats, plus the difference between the two stats. Using this formula, we can try to reverse engineer the other Pokemon used to generate Mewtwo's special attack. We know that Mewtwo's resulting base special attack is 154. Let's assume that Mew's special attack of 100 is the lower. Doing a little bit of algebra, we know that in order to get a Pokemon with Mewtwo's special attack, you would need to splice Mew with someone with a base special attack of 127, which doesn't exist. However, Primarina has the closest at 126, which I think we can safely chalk up to a rounding error. So that accounts for all of the base stats. Mewtwo's ability Pressure could come from a whole bunch of Pokemon, but if we stick to our no legendary rule, then it has to be one of these. I'm going to guess Aerodactyl, since it's from Kanto and could be revived using a similar gene splicing process on the very same island where Mewtwo was made. But take your pick. And that brings us to movesets. Mew can famously learn any move in the game via TM. Mewtwo can't do that, which honestly probably means that Team Rocket scientists screwed up a little bit and lost some of those genes in their splicing process. As for the level up moveset, Mew and Mewtwo share some moves, but not all. Of the 16 moves that Mewtwo can learn by level up, 5 of them can be accounted for with Mew's original genetic data. Throwing in some Medicham DNA can get it Confusion, Psycho Cut, Guard Swap, Power Swap, and Recover. Disable, Swift, Future Sight, and Psy Strike, being an upgraded version of Psy Shock, could come from any number of Pokemon. But I think my personal favorite is Weirdeer, which could explain Mewtwo's weird little horns, and it seems like it has a bit of a loose connection to Arceus, being another white and yellow deer, and it seems like Team Rocket would want just a little bit of God in their super weapon. But you can also fish up Slowpoke and Slowbro right off the coast of Cinnabar Island, so that's probably more likely. And lastly, Safeguard and Mist could come from Dragonite or Altaria. Dragonite as the Kanto boy makes the most sense, but I'm going to choose to believe that they use some DNA from this thing instead. Is it unlikely? Sure, but it is possible. Don't tell me it's not. And there you have it. If you want to create your very own Mewtwo, all you need is one whole Mew, a cup of Hydrapple and Stoutland, a dash of Primarina and Aerodactyl, and a healthy helping of Medicham, Weirdeer, and Alomomola. Substitutions available. Throw in some adorable puppies of debatable origin, and finish it all off with some Ice Cube on top. Let bake for 7 months, and you have your very own biological super weapon. Remember, the circumstances of one's birth are irrelevant. It's what you do with your massive ice cube head that determines who you are. Until next time. And a huge thank you to all my supporters on Patreon, including Alakazam, Aspa102, Big Dog Tie4 to Win, Captain Kirby, Sidian, Sherry and Mark, Stylish, The Boss Killer 94, Ty Studio, Tricks of Crows, and did you know that the character limit on Patreon is very high? Well, it is high enough in fact that I could name myself M.